She scrubbed floors for pennies, while he counted millions. But when he humiliated her in front of everyone, he had no idea that the quiet maid's daughter held the power to destroy everything he'd built. What happens when the person you've spent years looking down on turns out to own your entire future? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of Maya Rodriguez, a 24-year-old who worked nights cleaning office buildings to pay for law school. And this is Richard Blackwood, a real estate mogul who believed money made him untouchable. Tonight, at the most exclusive charity gala in Manhattan, their worlds would collide in a way that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes, the person mopping your floors is the one holding your fate in their hands. Tonight, Maya would discover that her mother's dying words weren't just advice, they were the key to everything. The elevator hummed quietly as it carried Maya Rodriguez up 43 floors to the executive offices of Meridian Financial Tower. It was 11:47 p.m., and while most of Manhattan slept, Maya's night was just beginning. She adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag, heavy with cleaning supplies, and checked her watch. 3 buildings tonight, then straight to her 8 a.m. constitutional law class at Columbia. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding, revealing a world of polished marble floors and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of the city's glittering skyline. This was the 43rd floor, home to Blackwood Enterprises, one of New York's most powerful real estate development companies. Maya had been cleaning these offices for 8 months now, moving like a ghost through spaces that cost more to furnish than most people made in a year. She pushed her cart down the hallway, her rubber-soled shoes silent on the pristine floors. The walls were lined with photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, and handshake deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In every photo, one man stood at the center, Richard Blackwood III, heir to a real estate empire built by his grandfather in the 1940s. She had seen him exactly once, 3 months ago, when he'd stayed late for a conference call with investors in London. He hadn't acknowledged her presence, hadn't even looked up from his mahogany desk as she emptied his trash and dusted around his awards. To him, she was invisible, just another part of the building's infrastructure, like the air conditioning or the security cameras. But Maya saw everything. She saw the stress lines around his eyes in the executive portraits. She noticed the way his assistant left aspirin on his desk along with his morning coffee. She'd seen the legal documents scattered across his conference table late at night, papers marked with red ink and urgent sticky notes, numbers that didn't add up, debts that were coming due. What Richard Blackwood didn't know was that Maya Rodriguez wasn't just a night janitor putting herself through school. She was the daughter of Carmen Rodriguez, who had spent 37 years as a housekeeper for Manhattan's elite before a sudden heart attack took her life 18 months ago. Carmen had been more than just domestic help to her employers. She had been confidant, advisor, and keeper of secrets for some of the city's most powerful families. Among Carmen's possessions, Maya had found something that would have shocked the people who'd looked through her mother as if she were furniture. Hidden in a safety deposit box, along with her mother's modest savings, were documents that told a very different story about the quiet woman who'd spent decades scrubbing other people's toilets and making their beds. Carmen Rodriguez had been an investor. Not in stocks or bonds, but in something far more valuable in a city like New York: information. Over the years, she'd overheard conversations, seen documents left carelessly on tables, witnessed the private moments when powerful people revealed their true selves. and Carmen had been wise enough to occasionally invest her modest savings in the right opportunities, always quietly, always carefully, through intermediaries who ensured her anonymity. Maya pulled out her phone and scrolled through her law school schedule. Constitutional law at 8 a.m., corporate finance at 2 p.m., and then her shift at the second building started at 6 p.m. She'd been running on 4 hours of sleep for 2 years now, but it would all be worth it when she graduated next spring. Her mother had died believing that education was the only way to break the cycle, the only way to ensure that Maya would never have to bow her head to anyone. "Knowledge is power, mija," Carmen used to say, her hands rough from years of harsh cleaning chemicals. But real power comes from knowing how to use what you know. As Maya began her cleaning routine in the executive conference room, she couldn't help but notice the papers spread across the table. Financial projections, loan agreements, and what looked like increasingly desperate correspondence with creditors. Blackwood Enterprises, for all its gleaming success, was in serious trouble. The company had overextended itself on a massive development project in Lower Manhattan, a luxury residential complex that was supposed to revolutionize affordable housing while generating enormous profits. But construction delays, cost overruns, and a lawsuit from environmental groups had turned the project into a financial black hole. Maya could see from the documents that the company owed nearly $80 million to various creditors, with payments coming due that would either make or break the Blackwood empire. She'd learned to read financial statements in her corporate law classes, and these numbers told the story of a company teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. Richard Blackwood was fighting to save not just his business, but his family's legacy. Maya finished cleaning the conference room and moved to Blackwood's private office. The space was a monument to inherited wealth. Leather-bound books that looked like they'd never been opened, a vintage globe that doubled as a liquor cabinet, and family photographs spanning 3 generations of Blackwood's success. On the wall behind his desk hung a portrait of his grandfather, the original Richard Blackwood, who'd built this empire from nothing after returning from World War II. As she dusted the frame, Maya found herself studying the old man's face. There was something in his eyes that reminded her of her own grandfather, a construction worker who'd taught her that dignity didn't depend on the size of your bank account. Both men had built something from nothing, but only one had managed to pass down respect along with wealth. The current Richard Blackwood had inherited money, but he'd never learned the value of the people who helped him maintain it. He treated his employees like interchangeable parts, his cleaning staff like shadows, and anyone without a trust fund like they were somehow less human. Maya had witnessed his casual cruelty firsthand, the way he spoke to his assistant when she made small mistakes, the way he dismissed the security guard's attempts at friendly conversation, the way he looked through service workers as if they simply didn't exist. Tonight, as Maya cleaned around the evidence of his empire's potential collapse, she thought about the safety deposit box back in her small apartment in Queens. Inside that box were documents that could change everything, not just for her, but for the man who'd spent his entire life believing that money made him untouchable. Carmen Rodriguez had always been careful with her investments, but she'd made one purchase that even Maya was still trying to fully understand. 3 years ago, through a complex web of holding companies and intermediaries, Carmen had quietly acquired something that no one would have expected a housekeeper to own. She had bought Richard Blackwood's debt. Not all of it, but enough. When Blackwood Enterprises had needed emergency funding for their Lower Manhattan project, they'd accepted money from a private investment firm called Cornerstone Holdings. What they didn't know was that Cornerstone was a front company, And the real money came from Carmen Rodriguez's carefully managed portfolio, built over decades of $20 investments and compound interest, guided by overheard conversations about market trends and inside information about upcoming developments. Maya finished cleaning the office and stood for a moment looking out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, in boardrooms and penthouses, powerful people were making decisions that affected thousands of lives. They made those decisions believing that people like Maya didn't matter, that their voices could be ignored because they didn't have enough zeros in their bank accounts. Tomorrow night was the annual Meridian Foundation Charity Gala, held right here in the Blackwood building. It would be attended by the city's elite, politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and old money families who'd been running Manhattan society for generations. Maya knew about the gala because she'd be working it, invisible in her cleaning uniform, while millionaires celebrated their generosity over $1,000-a-plate dinners. What none of them knew was that the quiet young woman emptying their champagne glasses would soon be holding the future of one of their most prominent members in her hands. Maya packed up her cleaning supplies and headed for the elevator. As the doors closed and the floor numbers descended, she thought about her mother's final words, spoken from a hospital bed as her heart finally gave out from years of overwork and stress. "The papers in the safety deposit box, mija. When the time is right, you'll know what to do with them. Remember, respect is earned, not inherited. And sometimes the people who think they're untouchable need to be reminded that everyone answers to someone." The elevator reached the ground floor, and Maya stepped out into the marble lobby. In less than 24 hours, she would return to this building not as invisible help, but as someone with the power to change Richard Blackwood's life forever. She just didn't know it yet. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Maya's alarm pierced through the darkness at 6:30 a.m., dragging her from a restless sleep filled with dreams of numbers and legal documents. She'd managed exactly 3 hours and 47 minutes of rest before her body demanded she return to the world of the living. Her studio apartment in Astoria was a far cry from the gleaming offices she cleaned each night. A converted garage space with thin walls that let in every sound from the street below. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, rubbing her eyes and trying to shake off the exhaustion that had become her constant companion. On the milk crate that served as her nightstand sat 2 items that represented the 2 halves of her life. A thick constitutional law textbook with pages worn soft from countless readings, and a small bronze key that opened Safety Deposit Box 247 at Queens Community Bank. Maya had discovered the key 6 months after her mother's funeral, tucked inside an old coffee tin at the back of Carmen's closet. Along with it was a handwritten note in Carmen's careful script. "For when you're ready to understand what I've been building for us." The safety deposit box had contained more than Maya could have imagined, not just the legal documents that proved her mother's secret investments, but also a detailed journal chronicling 37 years of careful observation and strategic thinking. Carmen Rodriguez hadn't just been cleaning houses. She'd been studying the people who lived in them, learning their weaknesses, their patterns, their secrets. Maya pulled on her usual uniform, dark jeans, a Columbia University sweatshirt her mother had bought her as a graduation gift, and sneakers that had seen better days. As she prepared her instant coffee, a luxury she allowed herself on particularly difficult mornings, she thought about the conversation she'd overheard 3 weeks ago in Richard Blackwood's office. She'd been replacing the water bottles in his mini-fridge when his lawyer, Jonathan Hayes, had arrived for an emergency meeting. Maya had continued working, invisible as always, while the two men discussed the company's deteriorating financial situation. "The payment to Cornerstone Holdings is due in 6 weeks, Hayes had said, his voice tight with concern. $87 million, Richard. If we can't make that payment, they have the right to call in the entire debt immediately." Blackwood had laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Cornerstone Holdings is some shell company, probably run by offshore investors looking to make a quick profit. They'll negotiate. They always do." "And if they don't," Hayes had pressed, "then we lose everything. The company, the buildings, the foundation. 3 generations of work down the drain because of one bad project." Maya had finished her work and left without either man acknowledging her presence. But their words had echoed in her mind for weeks, especially because she knew something they didn't. Cornerstone Holdings wasn't run by faceless offshore investors. It was her mother's creation, carefully constructed over years of planning. Now, as Maya rode the subway into Manhattan for her morning classes, she pulled out her mother's journal and read entries she'd memorized but still found difficult to believe. March 15th, 2018. "Richard Blackwood Jr. called me girl today, even though I've worked for his family for 12 years. His son treats the mailman with more respect than he shows me. These people think money makes them better than everyone else. Maybe it's time they learned what happens when the people they ignore start paying attention." September 3rd, 2019. Overheard conversation about Blackwood Enterprises needing emergency funding for their Manhattan project. They're approaching traditional lenders, but the terms are going to be brutal. Opportunity here. Called David Martinez at Cornerstone. He's ready to make the loan offer through our holding structure. January 22nd, 2020. Loan approved. $95 million at 8.5% interest secured against all company assets. They have no idea they just borrowed money from a housekeeper. Richard III signed the papers without even reading them carefully. His arrogance will be his downfall. Maya closed the journal as her train pulled into the Columbia University station. Her constitutional law professor, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, was known for cold-calling students without warning, and Maya couldn't afford to be unprepared. She'd worked too hard to get here to let exhaustion derail her studies now. The law school building was a stark contrast to the office towers she cleaned at night. Here, the hallways buzzed with intellectual energy and passionate debate. Students gathered in small groups discussing landmark cases and legal theories that could reshape society. Maya loved this world, but she'd never quite felt like she belonged in it. Most of her classmates came from families where law school was an expectation, not a desperate gamble. They had study groups and expensive coffee shops and internships at prestigious firms lined up through family connections. Maya studied in the library until closing time and worked 3 jobs to pay for textbooks she bought used and highlighted carefully to resell at the end of each semester. "Ms. Rodriguez," Dr. Chen's voice cut through Maya's thoughts as she took her seat in the lecture hall. "Since you're here early, perhaps you can start us off. In the case of Citizens United versus FEC, the Supreme Court ruled that corporations have the same free speech rights as individuals. Do you agree with this interpretation?" Maya straightened in her chair. This was the kind of question that required not just knowledge of the law, but an understanding of its real-world implications. "I think the decision reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of power dynamics in American society. When the court granted corporations the same speech rights as individuals, they ignored the fact that those entities have vastly different resources to amplify their voices." She thought about Richard Blackwood's office, about the casual way he discussed spending millions while she counted quarters for the laundromat. The ruling essentially said that money equals speech, which means those with more money get a louder voice in our democracy. It's not about equal rights, it's about proportional influence based on wealth. Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "Excellent analysis. Can you give us a specific example of how this plays out in practice?" Maya's mind immediately went to the charity gala happening that evening. Look at how political influence actually works in a city like New York.
Wealthy developers and business leaders don't just donate to campaigns, they host fundraisers, sit on boards, and have direct access to elected officials. Their speech reaches lawmakers in ways that ordinary citizens' speech never could. The law treats these situations as equal, but the reality is completely different. After class, Maya hurried across campus to the library. She had 4 hours before her next class, and she needed to research corporate debt restructuring for a paper due next week. But as she opened her laptop, her mind kept drifting to the conversation she'd overheard in Blackwood's office. 6 weeks until the payment was due, 6 weeks until Richard Blackwood would discover that his company's survival depended on the mercy of someone he'd spent years treating as invisible.
Maya pulled up Cornerstone Holdings' corporate filings on her laptop. The company existed on paper as a private investment firm specializing in real estate development loans. Its board of directors consisted of David Martinez, a legitimate financial advisor her mother had hired, and 2 other professionals who managed the company's public face. But the real controlling interest belonged to the Carmen Rodriguez Trust, established with the life insurance money Maya's mother had received after her husband's death in a construction accident 12 years earlier. Carmen had been playing a long game, investing small amounts consistently while learning everything she could about the families she worked for. She'd studied their businesses, their weaknesses, their relationship dynamics, and when opportunities arose, she'd been ready to act. The Blackwood family had been her longest study. Carmen had worked for Richard Blackwood Jr. for 15 years, watching as he'd gradually lost touch with the values that had built his family's fortune. She'd seen how he'd raised his son to believe that wealth meant superiority, that working people existed solely to serve those born into privilege. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the building management company. Gala setup. Tonight starts at 5 p.m. Need extra staff for coat check and cleanup. Interested? She stared at the message for a long moment. The charity gala would be her chance to see Richard Blackwood in his natural habitat, surrounded by the people whose approval he craved. It would also be the perfect opportunity to observe him before making the decision that would change both their lives. Maya typed back, "I'll take the shift." She spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, but her research kept leading her back to questions about corporate accountability and wealth inequality. She read case studies about family businesses destroyed by over-leveraging, about workers laid off while executives received bonuses, about communities displaced by development projects that benefited only their investors. The Blackwood Lower Manhattan project was supposed to create affordable housing, but Maya had seen the real plans in those scattered documents on the conference table. The affordable units were priced well beyond what most working families could manage, and the truly low-income housing was relegated to a single building that would be built last, if at all. Carmen had been playing a long game, investing small amounts consistently while learning everything she could about the families she worked for. She'd studied their businesses, their weaknesses, their relationship dynamics, and when opportunities arose, she'd been ready to act. The Blackwood family had been her longest study. Carmen had worked for Richard Blackwood Jr. for 15 years, watching as he'd gradually lost touch with the values that had built his family's fortune. She'd seen how he'd raised his son to believe that wealth meant superiority, that working people existed solely to serve those born into privilege. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from her supervisor at the building management company. Gala setup. Tonight starts at 5 p.m. Need extra staff for coat check and cleanup. Interested? She stared at the message for a long moment. The charity gala would be her chance to see Richard Blackwood in his natural habitat, surrounded by the people whose approval he craved. It would also be the perfect opportunity to observe him before making the decision that would change both their lives. Maya typed back, "I'll take the shift." She spent the rest of the afternoon in the library, but her research kept leading her back to questions about corporate accountability and wealth inequality. She read case studies about family businesses destroyed by over-leveraging, about workers laid off while executives received bonuses, about communities displaced by development projects that benefited only their investors. The Blackwood Lower Manhattan Project was supposed to create affordable housing, but Maya had seen the real plans in those scattered documents on the conference table. The affordable units were priced well beyond what most working families could manage, and the truly low-income housing was relegated to a single building that would be built last, if at all. Richard Blackwood was profiting from a housing crisis his own family's development practices had helped create. He was gentrifying neighborhoods while claiming to solve homelessness, pricing out the very people his charity gala would claim to support. As Maya gathered her books to leave for her corporate finance class, she made a decision. Tonight, she would attend the gala not just as invisible help, but as someone with the power to hold Richard Blackwood accountable for his choices. She thought about her mother's final words, about respect being earned rather than inherited. Carmen Rodriguez had spent decades being overlooked and underestimated by people who confused their bank balances with their human worth. But Carmen had been building something all along, not just financial security for her daughter, but a lesson about the true nature of power. Real power didn't come from inherited wealth or fancy titles. It came from understanding how the world actually worked, from seeing the connections that others missed, from having the patience to wait for the right moment to act. Maya's moment was coming. Tomorrow morning, Richard Blackwood would wake up in his penthouse apartment, dress in his expensive suits, and prepare for another day of casual cruelty toward the people who kept his world running smoothly. But tonight, at his own charity gala, Maya would begin the process of teaching him what her mother had learned long ago. Everyone answers to someone, and sometimes the person holding your fate in their hands is the one you never bothered to see. The Meridian Foundation Charity Gala transformed the Blackwood Building's 40th floor into a glittering showcase of Manhattan's elite. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in cream silk, each centerpiece a carefully arranged display of white orchids that cost more than Maya made in a week. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city skyline, creating a backdrop that whispered of power and privilege. Maya arrived at 4:30 p.m., 30 minutes before the setup crew was scheduled to begin. She wanted time to familiarize herself with the space before the chaos of preparation began. The event coordinator, a sharp-featured woman named Patricia Winters, was already there, clipboard in hand, directing the placement of auction items and adjusting lighting with the precision of a military operation. "You're the additional coat check staff?" Patricia asked without looking down from her checklist. Her tone carried the casual dismissiveness that Maya had grown accustomed to from people who measured worth by job titles. "Yes, ma'am, Maya Rodriguez." "Good. Black pants, white shirt, hair pulled back. No jewelry visible. You'll be stationed near the elevator bank. Keep the tickets organized by number and don't engage in conversation with the guests unless they speak to you first." Patricia's eyes briefly scanned Maya's appearance. "You have appropriate attire?" Maya nodded. She'd borrowed a white button-down shirt from her roommate and pressed her only pair of black dress pants until they looked almost professional. It wasn't the designer uniform that the regular hotel staff wore, but it would suffice for someone expected to remain invisible. As the setup crew arrived and began transforming the space, Maya positioned herself where she could observe without being noticed. She watched as tables were arranged to encourage specific social dynamics, the tech billionaires near the environmental activists, the old money families positioned strategically between the new wealth and the political power brokers. Every detail was calculated to facilitate the kind of networking that drove this level of society.
The auction items were wheeled in on specialized carts. A week at a private villa in Tuscany, a custom piece from a renowned sculptor, front-row tickets to Broadway shows with meet-and-greet opportunities. But the centerpiece was a scale model of the Lower Manhattan Development Project, complete with LED lighting that highlighted the residential towers and community spaces that would theoretically house thousands of New York families. Maya studied the model carefully. It was beautiful, aspirational, and almost entirely fictional. The plans she'd seen scattered across Blackwood's conference table told the different story, a project designed to maximize profit while providing the minimum viable amount of actual affordable housing. The community garden shown in the model would become a parking garage. The child care center would be eliminated in the first round of budget cuts. The affordable units would be priced to attract young professionals, not the working families who desperately needed housing. "Beautiful, isn't it?" a voice said behind her. Maya turned to find Richard Blackwood himself approaching the model, his eyes gleaming with pride. He was younger than she'd expected, probably in his early 30s, with a kind of confident bearing that came from never having to question whether you belonged somewhere. His tuxedo was perfectly tailored, his dark hair styled with the casual perfection that money could buy. "Yes, sir," Maya replied, stepping back slightly. "It looks like it will help a lot of people." He smiled, the expression not quite reaching his eyes. "That's the goal. Sometimes you have to think big to make a real difference." He gestured toward the model. "This project will provide housing for over 2,000 families. It's going to transform that entire neighborhood." Maya bit back her response. She'd seen the real numbers. 2,200 units total, with only 180 genuinely affordable for low-income families. The rest would be market rate, or luxury affordable, priced for people making $75,000 a year or more, far beyond the reach of the families being displaced by gentrification. "It's wonderful," she said instead, maintaining the neutral tone expected of service staff. "Of course, not everyone understands the complexities of development finance," Richard continued, apparently enjoying the opportunity to explain his project to someone he assumed would be impressed. "There are people who think you can just build affordable housing without considering market realities. They don't understand that you need luxury units to subsidize the affordable ones." Maya nodded politely while thinking about the profit margins she'd seen in those scattered documents. The luxury units weren't subsidizing affordable housing. They were generating massive returns for investors while providing just enough low-income units to qualify for tax breaks and public relations benefits. It takes vision to see the bigger picture, to understand how these projects really work. Most people just see the surface level. "I'm sure you're right," Maya said, recognizing the tone of someone who enjoyed explaining things to people he considered his intellectual inferiors. Richard checked his watch, a Swiss timepiece that probably cost more than Maya's annual tuition. "Well, I should let you get back to work. Big night tonight." As he walked away, Maya felt a familiar anger building in her chest. It wasn't just his condescension that bothered her, it was his absolute certainty that he was doing good work, that his profit-driven development was actually helping people. He'd convinced himself that gentrification was community improvement, that pricing out working families was somehow a necessary sacrifice for the greater good. The guests began arriving at 7 o'clock, stepping out of black cars and yellow taxis in a parade of designer gowns and perfectly fitted tuxedos. Maya recognized faces from magazine covers and newspaper business sections, tech entrepreneurs who'd revolutionized entire industries, finance executives who controlled billions in assets, celebrities whose names appeared regularly in gossip columns. From her position at the coat check station, Maya had a perfect vantage point to observe the intricate social choreography of Manhattan's elite. She watched as conversations shifted from pleasantries to business deals, as charitable donations were leveraged into political influence, as the real work of maintaining power happened behind the facade of philanthropic generosity. Margaret Chen, the tech CEO whose company had been profiled in Forbes the month before, handed Maya a cashmere coat worth more than most people's monthly rent. "Thank you, dear," she said, without making eye contact, her attention already focused on the potential connections waiting inside. Senator William Hartley arrived with his wife, both of them moving through the crowd with the practiced ease of career politicians. Maya had read about Hartley's housing initiatives in the news, policies that sounded progressive in headlines, but contained enough loopholes to ensure that developers like Blackwood could continue operating with minimal oversight. As the evening progressed, Maya began to understand the ecosystem that sustained this level of wealth and influence. It wasn't just about money, it was about access, about the ability to have conversations that shaped policy and public opinion. The charity gala wasn't really about raising funds for homeless services, it was about maintaining the networks that allowed these people to control how those services were provided. Around 9 o'clock, Richard Blackwood took the small stage that had been set up near the auction display. He looked comfortable in front of the crowd, his voice carrying easily across the room as he began his remarks. "Thank you all for being here tonight. Your presence demonstrates a commitment to solving one of our city's most pressing challenges. Housing insecurity affects thousands of families right here in Manhattan, and too often we treat it as someone else's problem."
Maya listened as he painted a picture of corporate responsibility and community partnership. He spoke about the Lower Manhattan Project as if it were a purely altruistic endeavor, a sacrifice of potential profits in service of social good. The audience nodded approvingly, apparently satisfied that their charitable donations were supporting worthy causes. "Development is about more than building structures," Richard continued. "It's about building communities. It's about understanding that everyone deserves a place to call home, regardless of their economic circumstances." The irony was breathtaking. Maya thought about the families in the neighborhood where Blackwood's project was being built, families who were already receiving eviction notices as landlords sold their buildings to developers, families who would never be able to afford even the affordable units in the new complex. She thought about her mother, who had cleaned houses for decades while watching the family she worked for accumulate wealth that they used to reshape the city according to their preferences. Carmen had seen how these people justified their actions, how they convinced themselves that their self-interest aligned with the public good. As Richard concluded his speech to enthusiastic applause, Maya made a decision. She would give him one more chance to demonstrate the values he claimed to hold. She would create an opportunity for him to show whether his charitable words reflected his actual character. During the auction portion of the evening, Maya approached Patricia Winters with a carefully crafted request. "Excuse me, Miss Winters, I'm a student at Columbia Law, and I've been researching housing policy for a paper. Would it be possible for me to ask Mr. Blackwood just a quick question about the development project? I promise it won't take more than a minute." Patricia looked annoyed at the interruption. "Absolutely not. This is a private event, not a press conference. Return to your station immediately." But Richard had overheard the exchange. He turned toward them, his eyebrows raised with curiosity. "What's this about Columbia Law?" Maya felt her heart racing, but her voice remained steady. "I'm writing a paper on public-private partnerships in affordable housing development. I was hoping to ask you about the community input process for your Lower Manhattan project." Richard's expression shifted, and Maya recognized the look she'd seen countless times in law school. The subtle change that occurred when someone realized they were talking to an intellectual equal rather than a subordinate. For a moment, his mask of casual superiority slipped. "You're a law student?" he asked, his tone sharper now. "Yes, sir, second year. I'm particularly interested in how developers balance profit margins with community needs." The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that both of them understood. This wasn't a student asking for help with homework. This was someone who understood enough about development finance to ask dangerous questions. Richard's smile returned, but it was colder now, more calculated. "Well, I suppose everyone thinks they understand real estate development after a few law school classes." Maya felt the familiar sting of condescension, but this time it was different. This time she wasn't powerless to respond. This time she had information that could change everything. "Actually," she said quietly, "I think I understand more than you might expect." And in that moment, as Richard Blackwood looked at her with the first hint of uncertainty she'd ever seen in his eyes, Maya realized that her mother's plan was about to unfold exactly as Carmen had envisioned it. The stage was set. The players were in position, and tomorrow morning Richard Blackwood would discover that the young woman he'd just dismissed held the power to destroy everything he had inherited. The tension in the air was palpable as nearby conversations quieted, influential guests sensing drama unfolding in real time. Richard Blackwood's confident smile had frozen in place, his eyes scanning Maya's face as if trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly seemed more complex than he'd anticipated. "You think you understand more than I expect?" Richard repeated, his voice taking on an edge that the nearby guests hadn't heard before. "Well, understand what, exactly, do you think you understand about development finance that I don't?" Maya felt the weight of every conversation her mother had recounted, every late-night story about wealthy families who treated their household staff like furniture. This was the moment Carmen had been preparing her for, though neither of them had known it would come so soon. "I understand that your Lower Manhattan project is financed through Cornerstone Holdings," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I understand that you owe $87 million with a payment due in 6 weeks that your company can't make." The color drained from Richard's face. These weren't details that had been made public, weren't numbers that a coat check attendee should know. Around them, the ambient chatter of the gala continued, but the small circle of space where they stood had become charged with an entirely different energy. "How could you possibly know?" Richard began, then stopped himself. His lawyer's training kicked in, warning him not to confirm information that this young woman shouldn't possess. "I also understand," Maya continued, her voice growing stronger, "that you've been telling investors one story while planning something completely different. The community meetings where you promised affordable housing for working families, the environmental impact studies that somehow overlooked the groundwater contamination, the union contracts that you've been trying to break to cut construction costs." Senator Hartley, who had been standing nearby discussing campaign finance reform with a tech mogul, turned his attention toward the conversation. Margaret Chen stepped closer. Her business instincts recognized the scent of a corporate scandal developing in real time. Richard's composure was cracking. "I don't know who you think you are," he said, his voice rising slightly, "but you're clearly out of your depth here. These are complex business matters that require understanding how shell companies work," Maya interrupted. "How private investment firms can acquire debt through intermediary holdings. How someone could spend 37 years learning everything about the families they work for, including how those families conduct business." The mention of 37 years hit Richard like a physical blow. His eyes widened as pieces of a puzzle he didn't know existed began falling into place. "Carmen Rodriguez?" he whispered, the name escaping his lips before he could stop it. "My mother," Maya confirmed, watching as the full implications crashed over him like a wave. The small crowd that had gathered was no longer pretending to have other conversations. Patricia Winters looked horrified at the breach of protocol, but the powerful guests seemed fascinated by this unexpected theater. In their world, public confrontations were rare and carefully managed affairs. This raw, unscripted moment was more compelling than any planned entertainment. "Your mother was our housekeeper?" Richard said, his voice taking on the condescending tone Maya had heard so many times. "Whatever she told you about our business affairs..." "She told me about the time you made her work on Christmas Day because you were hosting a party. She told me about the time you refused to pay for her taxi home during a blizzard because the subway is good enough for people like her. She told me about the time you fired the previous housekeeper for asking for a raise to cover her son's medical bills." Each revelation landed like a slap. Richard's face cycled through emotions, shock, anger, embarrassment, as private family moments were exposed to his peers. Around them, the carefully maintained facade of refined society was giving way to something much more primal. She also told me, Maya continued, pulling a folded document from her jacket pocket, that she was tired of watching people like you profit from other people's desperation while treating the workers who built your wealth like they were disposable. She unfolded the paper, a copy of the Cornerstone Holdings loan agreement, complete with Richard's signature and the terms that would determine his company's fate. "You want to know what I understand about development finance?" Maya asked, her voice now carrying across the hushed room. "I understand that my mother, the woman you couldn't be bothered to learn the name of, owns your debt. All of it." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stared at the document, his face cycling through disbelief, horror, and rage. The assembled guests stood frozen, witnessing the kind of power reversal that their world was designed to prevent. "That's impossible," he finally managed. "Cornerstone Holdings is a major investment firm. They have offices in the financial district, staffed by legitimate professionals who manage investments for private clients. My mother was one of those private clients. She spent decades studying your family, learning your business practices, waiting for the right opportunity to teach you what she'd learned about respect." Margaret Chen stepped forward, her tech executive mind immediately grasping the implications. "Are you saying that a domestic worker leveraged enough capital to become a major creditor to Blackwood Enterprises?" "I'm saying that my mother, the woman you couldn't be bothered to learn the name of, understood something that people in this room have forgotten. She understood that real wealth isn't about inheritance or connections or fancy degrees. It's about patience, observation, and recognizing opportunity when it presents itself." Senator Hartley, ever the politician, sensed which way the wind was blowing. "This is quite remarkable," he said, his voice carrying the tone of someone already calculating how this story might play in the media. "A working-class woman building generational wealth through strategic investment. It's exactly the kind of financial literacy we should be encouraging." Richard turned on the senator with barely contained fury. "Don't you dare turn this into some political talking point. This woman," he gestured toward Maya, "and her mother conspired to undermine a legitimate business operation through deception and through the same investment strategies your family has used for 3 generations. The only difference is that your grandfather started with a trust fund, and my mother started with tips from cleaning houses." The comparison hung in the air like an accusation. Several guests nodded thoughtfully, recognizing the parallel that Richard seemed desperate to deny. "Your grandfather built wealth by recognizing opportunities in post-war development. My mother built wealth by recognizing opportunities in pre-bankruptcy desperation. Both of them invested money they'd earned through hard work. The only difference is that society decided one kind of work was worth more respect than the other." Patricia Winters, recognizing that the evening's carefully planned program was rapidly spiraling beyond her control, attempted to intervene. "Perhaps we should return to the auction portion of—" "No," Richard said sharply, his composure finally shattering completely. "I want to hear what this is really about. You want money? Fine, name your price, but don't stand there pretending this is about justice or respect or whatever story you've told yourself." Maya looked at him for a long moment, seeing not the powerful developer he pretended to be, but the spoiled child who had never learned that actions have consequences. "This isn't about money," she said quietly. "This is about choices. Tomorrow morning, you're going to wake up and remember every interaction you've had with people you considered beneath your notice. You're going to wonder how many of them were paying attention when you thought no one was watching." She folded the loan agreement and returned it to her pocket. "Cornerstone Holdings will honor the original terms of your loan, but when the payment comes due in 6 weeks, you'll know exactly who you're writing that check to. you'll know that the money keeping your company alive came from a woman whose name you never bothered to learn." Maya turned to address the assembled guests, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had just demonstrated that power could come from unexpected places. "My mother spent 37 years invisible to people like all of you. She cleaned your homes, served your meals, and listened to your conversations while you acted like she didn't exist. But she was building something the entire time. She was proving that intelligence and strategic thinking aren't limited to people with Ivy League degrees and trust funds." Margaret Chen began applauding slowly, recognizing both the brilliance of Carmen's strategy and the courage it had taken Maya to execute this confrontation. Other guests joined in, some out of genuine admiration, others because they recognized which side of this story would look better in tomorrow's newspapers. Richard Blackwood stood alone in the center of the room, his face flushed with humiliation and rage, the carefully constructed image he'd spent his life building. The benevolent developer, the charitable community leader, the deserving heir to his family's legacy, had been shattered by a woman in a borrowed shirt whose mother had cleaned his toilets. "This isn't over," he said quietly, his voice carrying a threat that everyone in the room could hear. Maya met his gaze steadily. "You're right. It's just beginning. Because now everyone in this room knows that the people you've spent your life ignoring have been watching you all along. And some of us have been taking notes." As she walked toward the elevator, leaving behind the wreckage of Richard Blackwood's reputation and the shocked murmurs of Manhattan's elite, Maya felt something she had never experienced before: the satisfaction of seeing justice served, not through the legal system or social programs, but through the patient, methodical application of economic leverage. Her mother had taught Richard Blackwood the most important lesson of all. Everyone answers to someone, and sometimes the person holding your fate in their hands is the one you never bothered to see. The elevator doors closed behind Maya with a soft whisper, sealing her away from the chaos she'd left in her wake. As the floors counted down, 40, 39, 38, she could feel her hands trembling for the first time all evening. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was beginning to fade, replaced by the magnitude of what had just occurred. She had just publicly humiliated one of New York's most powerful developers in front of the city's elite. There would be consequences, she was certain of that. Richard Blackwood wasn't the type of man to accept defeat gracefully, and he had resources she could barely imagine. But as the elevator reached the ground floor and Maya stepped into the marble lobby, she felt something she hadn't expected: relief. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt like she was honoring her mother's memory in a way that truly mattered. The next morning, Maya's phone began ringing at 6:15 a.m. The first call was from a blocked number that she let go to voicemail. The second was from David Martinez, the financial advisor who managed Cornerstone Holdings on behalf of the Carmen Rodriguez Trust. "Maya, we need to talk." His voice was tense when she finally answered the third call. "My office, as soon as you can get here." Maya caught the subway into Manhattan, her mind racing through possible scenarios. Had Richard found a way to challenge the loan documents? Had his lawyers discovered some loophole that could invalidate her mother's carefully constructed investment strategy? David's office was in a modest building in the financial district, far from the gleaming towers where the city's major investment firms operated. He was a second-generation Mexican-American who had built his practice serving clients that larger firms often overlooked: immigrants who'd built small businesses, working families planning for retirement, and the occasional domestic worker who'd managed to accumulate more wealth than anyone expected. "Sit down," David said as soon as Maya entered his office. His desk was covered with newspapers, and Maya could see her own face staring back at her from several front pages. "It's already in the news?" she asked, her stomach dropping. "Maya, half the people at that gala last night either own media companies or sit on their boards. This story was online before you made it home." David spread the papers across his desk. "Look at these headlines. The New York Times: Housekeeper's daughter exposes elite's hidden debts. The Wall Street Journal: Domestic workers' investment strategy challenges Wall Street assumptions. The New York Post: Cleaning up. Maid's kid owns millionaire's debt. Maya scanned the articles quickly. Most were surprisingly sympathetic to her mother's story, framing her as a financial genius who outmaneuvered Wall Street with patience and strategic thinking. Several quoted economists praising the sophistication of her investment approach. "This is actually good?" Maya asked, confused by the positive tone. "For you and your mother's legacy, yes. For Richard Blackwood, let's just say he's trending for all the wrong reasons." David pulled up a tablet showing social media feeds. The hashtag Invisible Investors was spreading across Twitter, with thousands of people sharing stories about underestimated workers who had built wealth through careful planning. Carmen's story had apparently struck a nerve, becoming a symbol of economic empowerment for people who felt overlooked by traditional financial institutions. "But here's what I'm worried about," David continued, his expression growing serious. "Blackwood's lawyers called me this morning. They're claiming that your mother obtained inside information through her employment, which would make her investments illegal. They're threatening to sue for fraud and demand immediate repayment of the full loan amount."
Maya felt the brief moment of triumph evaporating. Can they do that? They can try. The question is whether they can prove it. Your mother was very careful to document her investment decisions, and she never bought or sold based on specific confidential information. She studied public records, observed behavioral patterns, and made calculated bets based on trends she identified over years of observation. David opened a thick file folder. Carmen kept meticulous records. Every investment decision was documented with her reasoning, and she was careful to base her choices on publicly available information. But Blackwood's team is going to argue that her access to the family's private conversations gave her an unfair advantage. So what do? We fight. But first you need to understand something important. This isn't just about you anymore. Carmen's story has inspired people across the country. I've gotten calls from workers who want to start investment clubs, from financial literacy advocates who want to use her strategies in their programs, from politicians who want to hold hearings about economic inequality. Maya stared at the newspaper photos of herself, still struggling to process how quickly her private family story had become a public symbol. "There's something else," David continued. "I've been contacted by several major news outlets. They want to interview you, to tell your mother's full story, but I want you to think carefully about this. Once you go public, there's no going back. Richard Blackwood and people like him will use every resource they have to discredit you and your mother." Before Maya could respond, David's assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Martinez, there's a call from Ms. Rodriguez, someone from the offices of Senator Hartley." Maya looked at David questioningly. The senator had been at the gala, had witnessed the entire confrontation. "Maya Rodriguez?" The voice on the phone was crisp and professional. "This is Jennifer Walsh, Senator Hartley's chief of staff. The senator would like to meet with you this afternoon to discuss potential federal legislation inspired by your mother's investment strategies." After hanging up, Maya sat in stunned silence. 24 hours ago, she had been an invisible law student working 3 jobs to pay for school. Now she was apparently at the center of a national conversation about wealth inequality and economic justice. "David, what would my mother want me to do?" The older man smiled, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him all morning. "Carmen talked about you constantly. She was so proud that you were studying law, that you were going to have opportunities she never had. But she also worried that you might forget where you came from, that you might start to believe that success meant leaving your community behind." He pulled out a handwritten letter from the file. "She left this for you, to be opened if her investment strategy ever became public." Maya's hands shook as she unfolded her mother's familiar handwriting. "Mija, if you're reading this, it means the plan worked. Richard Blackwood or someone like him finally learned that the people they ignore are the ones who've been watching them all along. I know you're scared right now, and you're probably wondering if I did the right thing. But remember what I always told you. We don't get justice by asking nicely. We get it by being smarter than the people who think they're better than us. You have a choice to make now. You can take the money and disappear, build a quiet life away from all this attention. There's nothing wrong with that choice. Or you can use what I've built to help other people like us, people who've been told they don't matter, that their work isn't valuable, that they should be grateful for whatever scraps they're given. If you choose to fight, remember that this was never about revenge. It was about proving that intelligence and determination don't depend on where you start in life. It was about showing that the people who clean offices and serve meals and take care of other people's children are just as capable of building wealth and wielding power as anyone else. Whatever you decide, I'm proud of you. You are my greatest investment, and you've already given me returns I never dreamed possible. Love always, Mama." Maya wiped tears from her eyes and looked up at David. "What exactly would fighting look like?" "Well, first we defend against Blackwood's legal challenges. That could take months and cost a lot of money, but I think we can win. Then, if you're willing, we use the platform you've been given to advocate for policies that help working families build wealth. Financial literacy programs, support for small investors, regulations that prevent the kind of predatory development practices that Blackwood has been using." Maya thought about the conversation she'd overheard between Richard and his lawyer, about the families being displaced by his development project, about the promises he'd made to the community that he had no intention of keeping. And Richard's payment to Cornerstone Holdings? Still due in 6 weeks. If he can't make it, we have the right to call in the full debt immediately. His company goes into bankruptcy, and the Lower Manhattan project gets halted until new financing can be arranged. Maya realized that her decision would affect more than just her own life. Hundreds of construction workers were employed on Blackwood's project. Families were counting on those affordable housing units, even if they weren't as affordable as promised. Is there a way to restructure the deal? To force him to honor his original commitments to the community while still making his payments? David raised an eyebrow. You want to negotiate with him? After what happened last night?
I want to use the leverage my mother built to make sure her sacrifice actually helps people. Richard Blackwood can keep his company, but he's going to deliver the affordable housing he promised. He's going to pay fair wages to his workers. And he's going to learn that people who've been invisible to him for years are now watching his every move. Maya stood up, feeling the weight of her mother's legacy settling on her shoulders. It was a heavy burden, but it was also a source of strength she'd never known she possessed. Set up the meeting with Senator Hartley, she said, and call Richard Blackwood's lawyers. Tell them I'm willing to discuss terms for restructuring the loan, but make it clear that any agreement will include community oversight and binding commitments to the affordable housing promises he made. As Maya left David's office and walked back onto the busy streets of Manhattan, she realized that her mother's plan had been even more sophisticated than she'd understood. Carmen hadn't just been building wealth, she'd been building power, and now it was Maya's responsibility to use that power wisely. The girl who had cleaned office buildings to pay for law school was gone. In her place stood a young woman who controlled the financial future of one of New York's most prominent developers, and who was about to discover that real power came not from holding someone's debt, but from using that leverage to create justice for people who had never had a voice before. 3 days after the gala confrontation, Maya found herself in a conference room 40 floors above Manhattan, seated across from Richard Blackwood and his team of lawyers. The setting was deliberately chosen, Blackwood's own building, his territory, designed to remind everyone present of his power and status. But the dynamic had fundamentally shifted since their last encounter. Richard looked different than he had at the charity gala. The easy confidence was gone, replaced by the tight-lipped tension of a man who had spent 72 hours fielding angry calls from investors, board members, and political allies. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. His legal team consisted of 4 attorneys from one of Manhattan's most prestigious firms, led by Victoria Sterling, a woman whose reputation for corporate warfare was legendary even by Wall Street standards. She wore her silver hair in a severe bun and carried herself with the bearing of someone who had never lost a case she truly cared about winning. Maya sat with David Martinez and Sarah Chin, a civil rights lawyer who specialized in community development law. Sarah had volunteered her services after reading about Carmen's story in the Washington Post, seeing an opportunity to advance housing justice through an unexpected avenue. "Let's dispense with pleasantries," Victoria Sterling began, her voice crisp and commanding. "Miss Rodriguez, your mother's investment strategy may have been technically legal, but it was built on a foundation of deception and breach of fiduciary duty. No court in this country will uphold contracts that were obtained through—" "Through what?" Sarah Chen interrupted smoothly. "Through a domestic worker paying attention to her surroundings? Through a woman studying public records and making informed investment decisions based on observable market trends?" Maya watched the exchange with fascination. This was how power really worked in rooms like this, not through passionate speeches or moral arguments, but through the careful deployment of legal precedent and procedural knowledge. "Miss Rodriguez had access to confidential information," Victoria continued. "Miss Rodriguez had access to information that her employers chose to discuss in her presence. If Mr. Blackwood's family was conducting sensitive business conversations in front of their household staff, that represents a failure of their own security protocols, not a breach of ethics on my client's part." Richard shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Maya could see him remembering all the times he'd treated Carmen as invisible, discussing family business as if she weren't in the room. David Martinez opened a thick folder and spread documents across the conference table. Carmen Rodriguez documented every investment decision with publicly available sources, market analysis from financial publications, property records from city databases, corporate filings that anyone could access through the SEC. Her advantage wasn't inside information, it was patience and careful observation. Maya spoke for the first time since entering the room. "My mother understood something that people in this building seem to have forgotten. She understood that information is only valuable if you know how to interpret it. She spent 37 years watching wealthy families make the same mistakes over and over again, over-leveraging their assets, ignoring community feedback on development projects, assuming that their success was permanent." Victoria Sterling's expression hardened. "And you think that gives you the right to hold this company hostage?" "I think it gives me the right to ensure that promises made to communities are actually kept," Maya replied calmly. "Mr. Blackwood stood in front of 500 people 3 nights ago and spoke passionately about his commitment to affordable housing. I'm here to help him live up to those commitments." Richard finally spoke, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "You want to renegotiate the terms of a legal contract based on what you think is morally appropriate. That's not how business works." Maya leaned forward slightly, her voice remaining steady. "Actually, Mr. Blackwood, that's exactly how business works when one party has leverage and the other needs something. Right now, you need time to make your payment to Cornerstone.
I'm prepared to give you that time, but only if you're willing to demonstrate that your company can be trusted to honor its commitments. Sarah Chen slid a document across the table. We've prepared a modified payment schedule that extends your timeline by 6 months. In exchange, Blackwood Enterprises will commit to specific, binding requirements for the Lower Manhattan project. Victoria Sterling scanned the document quickly, her expression growing increasingly grim. These terms are completely unreasonable. Community oversight committees, independent financial audits, minimum wage guarantees that exceed industry standards. Minimum wage guarantees that match what Mr. Blackwood promised at community meetings, Maya corrected. Independent audits that ensure affordable housing units are actually affordable to the families who need them. Community oversight that gives residents a voice in how their neighborhood is developed. Richard studied the document with the careful attention of someone looking for escape routes. And if we refuse these terms? David Martinez answered matter-of-factly. Then the original loan terms remain in effect. Payment due in full in 3 weeks. If you can't make the payment, Cornerstone Holdings exercises its right to call in the debt immediately. The silence in the room was deafening. Maya could hear the faint hum of air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, she could see the Lower Manhattan neighborhood where Richard's project was supposed to create affordable housing, the same neighborhood where families were already being displaced by rising property values. There's something else, Maya continued, pulling out her phone and opening a news article. The Washington Post published an investigation this morning about your company's development practices. Apparently, this isn't the first time Blackwood Enterprises has promised affordable housing and delivered something quite different. She slid her phone across the table. The headline read, "Patterns of Promises: How One Developer's Housing Projects Consistently Fall Short of Community Commitments." Richard's face went white as he scanned the article. The investigation detailed 3 previous Blackwood developments where affordable housing commitments had been quietly abandoned or significantly reduced after initial approvals were obtained. The reporter interviewed families who were displaced by your previous projects, families who were told they'd be able to return to their neighborhoods once construction was complete, but discovered that the affordable units were priced well beyond their reach. Victoria Sterling was reading over Richard's shoulder, her professional composure beginning to crack. This wasn't just about one loan anymore. It was about a pattern of behavior that could trigger regulatory investigations and class action lawsuits. The story also mentions that several city council members are calling for hearings about developer accountability. It seems your company's practices have attracted attention from people with the power to change zoning laws and development approval processes. Maya watched Richard's face as the full scope of his situation became clear. The loan payment was the immediate crisis. The real threat was the systematic unraveling of the political relationships and regulatory advantages that had allowed his company to operate with minimal oversight for decades. "What exactly are you proposing?" Richard asked finally, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance. Maya opened her own folder and pulled out a detailed proposal that she and Sarah had spent the previous day crafting. "A partnership," she said simply. "Cornerstone Holdings becomes a permanent investor in Blackwood Enterprises with board representation and oversight authority for all future development projects." "You want a seat on our board?" Victoria Sterling asked incredulously. "I want community representation on your board. People who understand the impact of development decisions on working families. People who can ensure that affordable housing actually remains affordable, that job creation benefits local residents, that development serves communities rather than displacing them." Richard stared at the proposal as if it were written in a foreign language. "You're talking about fundamentally changing how this company operates." "I'm talking about making your company sustainable. Your current model depends on community goodwill that you've been systematically destroying. You can't keep promising affordable housing and delivering luxury condos. You can't keep displacing working families while claiming to solve the housing crisis." She gestured toward the window overlooking the city. There are thousands of families out there who need housing they can actually afford. There are communities that want to see responsible development that strengthens neighborhoods rather than destroying them. That's a market opportunity, Mr. Blackwood, but you can't access it with your current approach. David Martinez leaned forward. The financial projections are actually quite promising. Truly affordable housing, built with community support and fair labor practices, can be profitable if it's developed with realistic timelines and honest cost projections. The problem with your current model isn't that it's profitable, it's that it's unsustainable. Richard looked around the room at his lawyers, clearly hoping for a path back to the status quo that had served his family for 3 generations. But Victoria Sterling's expression was grim, and Maya could see that even she understood the weakness of their position. "And if we agree to these terms," Richard asked reluctantly, "then Cornerstone Holdings restructures your debt with manageable payment terms, provides additional financing for the Lower Manhattan project, and helps your company transition to a development model that actually serves the communities where you build." She stood up, gathering her papers with the quiet confidence of someone who held all the cards. "You have 48 hours to decide, Mr. Blackwood. After that, we proceed with the original loan terms and let the bankruptcy courts sort out your company's future." As Maya walked toward the conference room door, Richard called out behind her, "This isn't how business is supposed to work." Maya turned back, meeting his eyes with the steady gaze she'd inherited from her mother. "You're right," she said quietly. "Business is supposed to work for everyone, not just the people who start with advantages. My mother spent 37 years watching you and families like yours forget that lesson. Now it's time for you to remember it." The elevator doors closed behind Maya and her team, leaving Richard Blackwood alone with his lawyers and the wreckage of everything he thought he understood about power, privilege, and who really controlled the game. 2 years later, Maya Rodriguez stood on the roof of what had once been the most controversial development project in Lower Manhattan. Below her, the neighborhood bustled with a different kind of energy than she remembered from her childhood visits to this area. Children played in a community garden that occupied the space where a parking garage had originally been planned. Elderly residents sat on benches outside a community center that offered everything from job training programs to after-school tutoring. The Lower Manhattan Community Development Project had become a model that urban planners from across the country came to study. But the transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it certainly hadn't happened without conflict. Richard Blackwood had taken the full 48 hours to make his decision. When he finally called David Martinez to accept the restructuring terms, his voice had carried the weight of a man who understood that his old life was ending and something entirely different was beginning. The first 6 months had been brutal. Richard had fought the Community Oversight Committee at every turn, challenged their authority to review construction decisions, and attempted to water down the affordable housing commitments through legal technicalities. Maya had learned that dismantling generations of entitlement was harder than simply exposing it. But she had also learned something her mother had known instinctively. Real change required patience, persistence, and the willingness to engage in the tedious work of building new systems rather than just tearing down old ones. The breakthrough had come during a heated community meeting where residents were reviewing the latest construction plans. Richard had grown frustrated with questions about green space allocation and had reverted to his old condescending tone. "Look, I understand that everyone has opinions," he said, addressing a room full of long-time neighborhood residents, "but there are engineering constraints and financial realities that require professional expertise to understand." An elderly woman named Miss Esperanza Garcia had stood up slowly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had raised 6 children in the neighborhood and watched 3 generations of professional experts make promises they didn't keep. "Mr. Blackwood," she said quietly, "my grandson is studying civil engineering at Cooper Union.
My daughter-in-law is a certified public accountant. My neighbor runs a small construction business that's been in this community for 20 years. We're not asking you to explain engineering to us. We're asking you to explain why your professional expertise keeps producing buildings that our professional expertise tells us won't serve our community." The room had fallen silent. Maya had watched Richard's face as he realized that his assumptions about the intelligence and qualifications of community members were as outdated as his development model. That night, Richard had called Maya directly for the first time since the restructuring agreement had been signed. "I need help," he'd said simply. "I don't know how to do this differently." It was the first honest thing Maya had heard him say. The transformation that followed hadn't been dramatic or sudden. It had been built through hundreds of small decisions, weekly meetings, and the gradual development of trust between people who had never seen each other as equals. Richard had hired Maria Santos, a community organizer with a master's degree in urban planning, as Blackwood Enterprises' first director of community engagement. He had restructured his construction contracts to prioritize local hiring and fair wages. Most importantly, he had learned to listen to feedback without immediately defending his position or questioning the qualifications of the people offering it. Maya had completed her law degree and been offered positions at several prestigious firms, but she had chosen instead to establish the Carmen Rodriguez Center for Community Development Finance. The center operated out of a renovated building that had once housed a check-cashing business that charged predatory fees to people who couldn't access traditional banking. Now it was a place where residents could learn about building generational wealth through patient, strategic planning, the approach Carmen had perfected through decades of careful observation. "You know," Richard said, joining Maya on the rooftop, "I used to think this view belonged to me." Maya looked at him, noting how much he had changed over the past 2 years. The entitled arrogance was gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. He still wore expensive suits, but he also showed up to community meetings in work clothes when he'd been reviewing construction sites. "And now?" Maya asked. "Now I understand that I was just borrowing it. This neighborhood existed long before my family got here, and it'll exist long after we're gone. The best I can do is try to leave it better than I found it." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out over the community that had emerged from the collision of their two worlds. Maya thought about her mother, about the woman who had cleaned offices while building an investment portfolio that would reshape how people thought about wealth and power. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," Richard said. "I found some papers when I was going through my grandfather's belongings last month, letters from soldiers he served with during the war." Maya turned to look at him, curious about where this conversation was heading. One of the letters mentioned a sergeant who saved 3 men from a burning tank outside Bastogne, Sergeant Elias Thompson. The letter writer said Thompson was one of the bravest men he'd ever known, that he'd sacrificed his own safety to pull complete strangers out of danger. Maya felt her breath catch. "That was my great-grandfather." "I know. The letter writer was my great-grandfather. Your family saved mine 70 years ago, and somehow the universe arranged for your mother to end up working for us, watching us forget every lesson of courage and sacrifice that previous generations had tried to teach us."
Richard pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I think your mother would want you to have this." Maya opened the letter with trembling hands. It was written in faded ink on military stationery. "Dear Helen, I know I promised to write more often, but finding time and quiet has been harder than I expected. I wanted to tell you about something that happened yesterday that I'll remember for the rest of my life. We were pinned down by artillery fire when our tank took a direct hit. 3 boys were trapped inside, and the fuel was starting to burn. Most of us thought they were gone, but Sergeant Thompson, a man I'd barely spoken to before, ran straight into that fire. He pulled all 3 of them out, one by one, even though the tank exploded just minutes later. When I asked him why he'd risked his life for men he barely knew, he said something I can't stop thinking about. Nobody deserves to be left behind, especially when they're counting on the rest of us to do what's right. I hope I can be half as brave as that man when my time comes. Love always, William. Maya wiped tears from her eyes. The circle that had started with her great-grandfather's courage had somehow completed itself through her mother's strategic patience and her own willingness to use power responsibly. Carmen Rodriguez wasn't just your housekeeper, Richard continued. She was carrying forward a legacy of service that my family had forgotten we were supposed to honor. When she invested in my company's debt, she wasn't just making a financial decision. She was calling in a debt that went back generations. Maya folded the letter carefully and looked out over the neighborhood, where families were building lives in homes they could actually afford, where children played in spaces designed for community rather than profit, where the concept of development had been redefined to mean building up people rather than just buildings. "What happens next?" Richard asked. Maya smiled, thinking about the dozens of communities across the country that had reached out to the Carmen Rodriguez Center, asking for help in negotiating with developers, organizing investment clubs, and building the kind of economic power that could demand accountability from people who had never expected to answer to working families. "We scale it up," she said simply. "We teach other communities how to do what my mother did. We help working families understand that they have more power than they've been told. We change the conversation about who gets to make decisions about how our cities develop." She thought about the young woman who had started this journey 2 years ago, scrubbing floors and counting quarters for the laundromat. That woman believed that power was something other people possessed, that change was something that happened to her rather than something she could create. Carmen Rodriguez had known better. She had understood that real power wasn't inherited or granted. It was built through patience, observation, and the willingness to act when the moment was right. She had proven that the people who serve others are often the ones best positioned to understand what real leadership actually requires. As Maya and Richard walked back toward the elevator, she thought about all the household workers, security guards, cleaning staff, and service employees who moved invisibly through the worlds of powerful people. Some of them were undoubtedly watching, learning, and building their own strategies for creating change. The age of assuming that working people would remain forever powerless was ending. Carmen Rodriguez had fired the first shot in a revolution that would be fought not with protests or violence, but with compound interest, strategic patience, and the revolutionary act of refusing to remain invisible. Maya's phone buzzed with a text from Senator Hartley's office. The federal legislation inspired by her mother's story, the Community Investment Empowerment Act, had just passed the Senate Finance Committee and was heading for a full vote. The bill would provide tax incentives for investment strategies that included community oversight, fund financial literacy programs in underserved neighborhoods, and require transparency in development projects that received public subsidies. Carmen Rodriguez's name would be on that legislation. A woman who had never held elected office, never attended an Ivy League school, never inherited wealth or social connections, would have federal law named in her honor. As the elevator doors closed and they descended toward the busy street below, Maya realized that her mother's greatest achievement hadn't been building wealth or exposing Richard's arrogance or even securing affordable housing for hundreds of families. Carmen's greatest achievement had been proving that the story of who deserves power, who has the right to make decisions that affect entire communities, was ready to be rewritten, and that sometimes the people best equipped to write that new story were the ones who had been underestimated all along. The revolution would be quiet, strategic, and absolutely unstoppable, because it was being led by people who had learned the most important lesson of all. Everyone deserves to be seen, everyone's work has value, and everyone answers to someone. Sometimes the person holding your future in your hands is the one you never bothered to notice, but they've been watching you all along. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.